So this is part 2 of the series where we explain how MotivBase does what it does. How does it get to an understanding of culture? How does it size up trends, estimate where they are on their inflection curve or their maturity, help us understand the demographics behind them, the ethnographic DNA behind those topics, the motivations, attitudes, fears, and values, and so on and so forth. How does MotivBase get to all of this? If you recall in part 1, I talked very briefly about how we use this library of ethnographic factors in order to make sense of a particular model of topics that surrounds you have just searched. Now we're going to talk about how that analysis, that ethnographic part of the analysis is really done. First, a little bit of history, a little bit of background. This whole thing, this whole idea of starting a company for us came about 10 years ago when I had a simple hypothesis after reading and spending many years sort of studying the work of major social scientists over the last 40 years who had done incredible work in this space. The simple hypothesis was that if we actually went into field and did a ton of research, we would find that there was a limit to, or there were a finite number of motivations that drive us as human beings. As in, there's a limit to human motivation. It's finite, it can be understood, and it can certainly be built or turned into a model of some kind. Back then, of course, I was a bit naive. I expected that limit to come somewhere around the 100, 120, 200 mark. Little did I know, which we realize, of course, after years of research, that actually, yes, there is a limit with, after a certain point, you do hit a bit of a saturation point where you realize that you're no longer identifying new motivations that drive us as human beings in a particular culture. But by the time you hit that saturation point, you actually realize there are actually thousands of these motivations, attitudes, fears, and values that ultimately result in billions of permutations that help us make sense of topics, trends, based on how and the context with which people talk about them in culture. So that's a little bit of background around how all of this came about. Now, in order to, of course, identify and build this library of factors, we embarked on this massive project. Of course, back in the day, we thought we were doing this in order to write a book and do TED Talks and travel the world. It was an academic exercise, but over the course of a few years, we studied over 1.5 million individuals in the United States alone. And our PhD social scientists back then, who were just working with me out of the joy of working on this, discovered and built this finite but evolving library of ethnographic factors. Once we hit saturation point, we now knew that we had a model with which we could potentially train a machine to make sense of the patterns with which people communicate. And that was really step 2 of the process. So for example, if we know that, there's a particular behavior around food, and going back to that GMO example, let's say the motivation is about people who distrust government and corporations, and they really are motivated to find answers for themselves, to be individual thinkers, let's say. Let's say that's a motivation. The question became, is there a pattern with which people talk that points us in the direction of that motivation? And sure enough, manually our social scientists were able to answer that question and say, yes, of course there's a pattern, and here's what the pattern is. And then next, the task became more of a computer science challenge, which is using machine learning and natural language processing in order to teach a machine to understand those patterns, and obviously to learn to evolve those patterns as culture continues to evolve and change, and as linguistics change, and so on and so forth. So that was really the second part of the equation, is teaching the machine to understand these ethnographic factors so that when you run a search, depending on the context of topics that revolve, the hundreds of thousands of topics that revolve in the context around that search term at any given point in time, that sort of topic universe, if you will, that we talked about before, depending on how that is and how intricate that is and what's going on there, our machine is able to read that and then identify the right motivations, attitudes, fears, and values that help us understand the why behind the what. That's really the first step in that equation. The second step, of course, in that equation is once we have these ethnographic factors, we also have the strength, the relative strength of these ethnographic factors. We then have to determine and calculate the sociodemographics behind that particular topic. Now, this is where we used a lot of human intervention in order to fix some of the ongoing problems that we all experience with data collection on the internet. As you know, or probably already have experienced yourself, metadata is quite limited and quite disorganized on the internet. So we very quickly realized that we couldn't rely on metadata in order to solely, we still collect metadata, but we couldn't rely solely on metadata in order to understand demographics driving a particular topic. We had to build a mathematical model ourselves. And we did that through the lens of these ethnographic factors. We realized through a decade of social sciences research that there are certain demographic skews, sociodemographic skews that attach themselves to certain types of motivations, attitudes, fears, and values. And once we identified that, it allowed us to build a really intricate mathematical model with which we could extend the metadata and the missing aspects of the metadata and build and quantify the sociodemographics and estimate them with a less than 5% margin of error. And that's really what drives the back end of the calculation. So first we calculate the attitudes, values, fears, motivations. Based on that, in combination with metadata, our mathematical modeling comes into play and calculates the sociodemographics, reports on them. And then, of course, we already talked about how the core market and addressable market and so on are calculated, and everything else then flows out of that. So that's really the second half of the equation. And of course, the second half is really critical because it helps us understand the why. It helps us understand and build empathy for the consumer. So even though we're working with large N samples, and even though we're sort of, because we're not talking to consumers here, we're kind of losing a bit of the empathy equation that we as anthropologists enjoy in-field ethnography. And this helps us solve a part of that gap without losing the expediency of this form of research, where we're still able to put ourselves into the mind of the user, understand the unspoken intrinsic motivations and attitudes and fears and values that drive them, so that we can paint the picture of the why before we get to the what and the how. And that's really how the system is built, and that's really the pattern you'll also see exhibited in the various custom reports and analyses that our team of social scientists do for you when you commission custom ethnographic reports from them. So that's it. That's how the whole system works, and that's how we are able to do something that is not just unique in the marketplace, but that allows us to get certain results that are really industry challenging and leading. And of course, the last point I will mention is, and I think I briefly mentioned this before, we have done extensive benchmarking against our demographic data. And we've benchmarked this both against qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods. And usually we find a 5% or less than 5% discrepancy. I'm not going to talk about accuracy because you probably know where my own personal bias sits, because I don't believe that just because something is quantitatively done in the form of a survey, it's accurate. In fact, I would argue it's the opposite. So I really don't want to go down that path here. But what I will tell you is you'll find an up to 5% discrepancy. And that's, a small price to pay when you can get results in a matter of hours and days, or if not minutes. That's it. Thank you.